The bus wound its way through the mist like a cautious animal. Clara Hensley sat by the window, notebook resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the blurred shapes of pine trees that slid past in streaks of green and grey. The driver barely spoke as they approached the town, and Clara couldn't blame him. Fog clung to the coastline like it had no intention of leaving. The sign that greeted her was modest: "Welcome to Grey Shore," its paint chipped, the wooden post tilted as though the ocean wind had worn it down. Clara stepped off at the single bus stop, suitcase in hand, her boots sinking slightly into the damp gravel. She had come here chasing a story, a local folklore piece for Northwest Tales, a magazine that thrived on blending history with myth. It wasn't the most glamorous assignment, but for a journalist still clawing her way up, every feature counted. And Grey Shore had something she wanted: the legend of the Watcher. At the diner across from the harbour, she ordered black coffee and fish stew. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of fishermen hunched in a booth, their weathered hands wrapped around steaming mugs. A bell jingled as the waitress brought her order, giving Clara the first chance of the day to ask questions. "You're not from here," the waitress said flatly, setting down the bowl. "Just visiting. I'm writing an article on local folklore." Clara smiled. "Ever heard of the Watcher on the cliffs?" The waitress froze. It was the smallest pause, but noticeable. Her eyes darted to the two men in the booth, who immediately stopped their low conversation. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a beard greyer than the sea outside, muttered something under his breath. "Best not to stir up old stories," the waitress finally said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Tourists love to hear about ghosts, but around here we just focus on fishing. Safer that way." Clara jotted the reaction down in her notebook. Evasion always meant she was on the right trail. Later she walked down to the harbour, where boats rocked against creaking docks. A lone fisherman sat repairing a net, his cap pulled low against the drizzle. Clara introduced herself and asked again, carefully. "Don't print this," he said after a long silence, his voice low and gravelly. "People go missing near the cliffs. Has for years. They say it's the Watcher, an old soul, maybe a sailor who drowned, maybe something worse. You go up there, you feel it. Like you're not alone. Like eyes on the back of your neck." Clara's pen stilled. "You believe it?" The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Belief don't matter. People vanish. That's fact enough." By the time dusk fell, the town seemed to shrink further into itself. Windows shut early, streets emptied, and fog rolled thicker off the water. Clara checked into the only motel, a squat building with humming neon, and unpacked. The room smelled faintly of mildew, the kind of place where silence lingered too long. She opened her laptop, typing up notes, but the fisherman's words circled her thoughts. People vanish. At midnight, unable to sleep, she cracked open the window. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. From somewhere distant, carried faintly over the surf and wind, came a sound that could have been a gull, or a scream. Clara froze, her breath catching. For the first time since arriving, she felt it too. That crawling sensation on her neck. That prickle of being watched. The next morning broke with no sunshine, just a flat, grey sky that made it impossible to tell the time without a clock. Clara sipped weak motel coffee and scrolled through archived articles she had downloaded before coming. Most were brief mentions. Teen missing near cliffs, presumed drowned. Hiker never found after storm. The pieces were scattered across decades, never linked, and never deeper than a paragraph or two. Patterns were there if you looked closely. The disappearances clustered around Grey Shore, often near the cliffs or the lighthouse ruins just north of town. Yet no one had ever connected the dots. She packed her bag and decided to visit the sheriff's office. The building looked like a leftover from the 1970s, Its sign faded, the blinds crooked. Inside, Sheriff Maeve Larkin greeted her with a kind of tight-lipped politeness that carried a warning. "You're here about folklore," Larkin said after Clara introduced herself. "That's all it is, folklore. Nothing official connects those accidents." "Accidents?" Clara asked, raising a brow. The sheriff leaned back in her chair. "This is a dangerous coastline. Cliffs crumble, tides change fast. People come here from the city thinking it's scenic, but it's deadly. That's all." But Clara noticed the way the sheriff avoided her eyes when she said it. When Clara pressed, the sheriff's tone hardened. "My advice? Don't stir things up. Folks here don't appreciate outsiders making us sound like some ghost town. We're just trying to live our lives." Dismissed, Clara wandered toward the cliffs themselves. The ocean pounded below, slate-colored waves smashing against jagged rock. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries thin and sharp. She stood near the edge and felt it again, that crawling sensation, as though someone watched her from behind. When she spun, the trail was empty. That night she returned to the diner, hoping someone else would talk. The locals seemed more restless than before, their eyes flicking toward her whenever she lifted her notebook. Finally, the bearded fisherman from yesterday slid into her booth without invitation. "You want answers, you won't get them from Larkin," he said, voice low. "Talk to Evan Ward. Used to be sheriff before her. He wouldn't let it go. Cost him the badge." Clara leaned forward. "Where do I find him?" "Cabin out past Miller's Creek. Don't expect a warm welcome." The fisherman stood before she could thank him, leaving only the smell of brine and tobacco. Later, with directions scribbled in her notebook, Clara drove her rental down a winding forest road until she found the cabin. Weathered wood, shutters closed, smoke curling from the chimney. She knocked, and after a long pause, the door cracked open. Evan Ward looked like the sea had carved him from rock-lined face, sharp eyes that still burned with suspicion. "You're not a local," he said flatly. "Clara Hensley. I'm writing about the Watcher. They said you'd know more." He almost shut the door, but then something flickered in his expression. Resignation, maybe. He opened it wider. Inside, the cabin was cluttered with stacks of papers, maps of the coastline, and boxes filled with photographs. "They made me drop it," Evan said, sinking into a chair. "Town council, county, even the state. Said I was wasting resources, chasing shadows. But I know what I saw. The disappearances weren't accidents. People don't just walk off cliffs in the same spot, year after year." Clara studied the papers. Dates, names, circles drawn in red ink around the lighthouse ruins. "So who, or what, do you think the Watcher is?" Evan's eyes darkened. "I don't know. Could be a man. Could be worse. But whatever it is, it doesn't want us talking. And you," his gaze cut into her, sharp as a blade, "you've already attracted its attention." That night, back at the motel, Clara tossed in bed. At 2:13 a.m., she woke to a faint scraping sound against her window. She forced herself to look. Through the fog, a shadow stood just beyond the glass. Motionless. Watching. Her scream caught in her throat. And then, in a blink, it was gone. Clara woke to sunlight, pale and cold, but still sunlight, spilling weakly through the blinds. Her first thought was of the shadow. She leapt from bed, yanked the curtains open, and found only damp gravel and fog clinging to the lot. No footprints. No sign anyone had been there. Still, she couldn't shake the image. She called Evan. He answered on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep. "You saw it, didn't you? he asked before she even spoke. Clara hesitated. Something. Outside my window. Not surprised, Evan muttered. Once you start poking, it notices. Get dressed. Meet me at the cliffs. I'll show you something. By late morning, they stood at the northern edge of Grey Shore where the cliffs rose higher, sharper. A narrow trail cut through the pines, overgrown but still walkable. Evan led, his boots crunching against frost-hardened earth. This trail isn't on maps, he said. Locals pretend it doesn't exist. But it leads to the old lighthouse. Been abandoned since the 50s, after a storm collapsed part of the foundation. As they moved deeper, the roar of the ocean grew louder, mingling with the groan of wind through trees. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder. The sensation of being followed had burrowed under her skin, making every snapping twig tighten her chest. The ruins came into view at last. An old lighthouse, its tower cracked and leaning like a drunkard, its windows dark sockets. Beside it, the remnants of a keeper's cottage sagged beneath moss and ivy. Inside, dust coated the floor, but not evenly. In one corner, a blanket and lantern sat as though someone had used them recently. Clara crouched, brushing her hand over the floorboards. The dust had been disturbed. "Someone's been here," she whispered. Evan nodded grimly. "I've seen signs before. Food wrappers. Cigarette butts. But every time I get close, whoever it is disappears." They searched the cottage. Clara opened a cabinet and froze. Inside were faded photographs pinned against the wood. Images of missing people. All local. All faces she recognized from Evan's files. Her stomach turned. "This isn't folklore." "No," Evan said, his voice hard. "It's hunting ground." Suddenly, a noise echoed through the ruin, a scrape like boot against stone. Clara and Evan froze. Outside, in the fog rolling in from the sea, a figure stood, too far to make out details, but unmistakably human. Watching. "Stay quiet," Evan hissed, pulling Clara back into the shadow of the doorway. The figure lingered, unmoving, for what felt like hours but was only seconds. Then it stepped back into the fog and vanished. Clara's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, trying to capture evidence, but the screen showed nothing but grey mist. On the way back, she noticed subtle shifts in the town. People she passed on the street avoided eye contact more deliberately than before. At the diner, the waitress ignored her completely. Even the motel owner, normally indifferent, muttered under his breath when she walked by. "They know," Clara said to Evan later, her voice low. "They know someone's out here, and they're hiding it." Evan sighed, rubbing his temple. Grey Shore survives on silence. People look the other way, because it's easier than admitting something's rotten at the core. That night, Clara felt the walls closing in. As she typed her notes, the lights flickered. Then she heard footsteps in the hall outside her room. Slow, deliberate. She pressed her ear to the door. Nothing but the creak of old boards. When she dared to peek through the peephole, the hallway was empty. But just as she turned away, the faintest whisper reached her. Her name. Clara. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She staggered back, every nerve alight. She wasn't just chasing a story anymore. Something, or someone, had decided to chase her back. By morning, Clara's resolve had hardened. Fear had its grip on her, yes, but so did determination. If she backed out now, she'd leave with nothing. No story, no proof, just a fog-drenched nightmare. She returned to Evan's cabin, finding him already awake, maps and notes spread across his table. "You're pale," he remarked. "They whispered my name," Clara said bluntly. Outside my door. Evan's face tightened. Then we're out of time. He jabbed a finger at the map. Everything circles back to the lighthouse. If the Watcher exists, man or myth, it's there. Tonight, we end this. The storm rolled in by dusk. Wind howled through the trees as they made their way back to the ruins, flashlights slicing through fog that clung to every branch and stone. The path felt alive, each step echoing like it disturbed something ancient. When they reached the lighthouse, the sea was a black, raging beast below, waves slamming against rock hard enough to send spray over the cliff edge. The air smelled of salt and iron. Inside the ruined keeper's cottage, the lantern from yesterday was lit. Fresh smoke curled from it. "Someone's here," Clara whispered. A voice cut through the storm. "You should have left." From the shadows, 3 figures emerged. Men dressed in heavy coats, their faces obscured by scarves. One held a knife, another a length of rope. Clara's breath hitched. Evan stepped forward. "Smugglers," he spat. "All these years, hiding behind a ghost story." The tallest figure smirked. "Ghosts are useful. Folks stop asking questions. And when they do," he gestured to the pinned photographs on the wall, "they disappear." Clara's stomach twisted. The Watcher wasn't some supernatural curse. It was men. Men who had used the cliffs to run shipments, silence witnesses, and keep Grey Shore cowed by fear. "You killed them," Clara said, her voice trembling with rage. "Not killed," the man corrected coldly. "Removed. Buried by the tide." They advanced. Evan drew his old revolver, hand steady despite his years. "Back away. I won't ask twice." The storm screamed outside, rattling the ruins. Suddenly, lightning split the sky, illuminating the cliff through the broken windows. And there, clear as day, stood a figure. Tall, motionless, cloaked in mist, watching. All 4 of them, Clara, Evan, even the smugglers, froze. "What the hell?" one of the men stammered. Another bolt of lightning flashed, and the figure was gone. The smugglers broke first, panic unraveling their bravado. One lunged at Evan, the other 2 bolted for the door. The gunshot cracked like thunder, the man with the knife crumpling to the floor. Clara ducked, heart hammering, as the others fled into the storm. When silence returned, only the sound of the waves remained. Evan stood over the fallen man, chest heaving. "We'll call the state police. Finally get this town cleaned out." But Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the cliffs outside. She hadn't imagined it. She knew she hadn't. That figure, impossible, inhumanly still, a silhouette carved from the storm itself, had been there. Later, when the authorities came and the smugglers were rounded up, Grey Shore began to unravel. The truth about the smuggling ring spread quickly, the townspeople muttering that the Watcher had finally been unmasked. Clara filed her story, but even as she typed the words, the Watcher was only a legend used to mask a crime. She hesitated. Her fingers lingered over the keyboard, because she remembered the look in the smugglers' eyes when the figure appeared. Their fear wasn't staged. It was real. On her last night in Grey Shore, Clara walked alone to the cliffs. The ocean roared below, moonlight turning the fog to silver. She stood there, notebook pressed to her chest, waiting, and for just a moment she felt it again, the prickle at her neck, the weight of unseen eyes. She turned. Nothing. Or maybe, far down the cliff edge, a shadow fading into mist. She would never be sure. But one truth lingered, colder than the storm, sharper than the sea wind. The Watcher was still there.